What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Avernum 2 Crystal Souls, remake of Avernum 2, which is itself a remake of Exile Crystal Souls, all of which I am going through to sort of get up to date on the series before the remake of Avernum 4 drops later in 2025. But before we get into that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. What's more, though, in the case of Avernum 2 here, with this game having been out for as long as it has, in various forms going back to the 90s, it's a very well-documented game, so it's really not a difficult endeavor. But I did also want to mention right up front here that I am definitely going to be spoiling the first game, and that is because Avernum 2 is sort of a direct consequence of the first game, with Avernum 1 through 3 being a connected trilogy. So the events of 2 here are almost exclusively because of what happened in the first title, so it's kind of hard to talk about it without just outright spoiling what you've got going on there, which obviously I'm going to get into, which brings us to the game itself. So as I mentioned, I'm checking this game out ahead of the release of Avernum 4's remake, due out later this year. The entire series, of course, being from Spiderweb Software, a small company that is mostly just one guy, Jeff Vogel, and just given the nature of that kind of development, it's probably no small wonder then that Avernum 2 is not a game that I would say makes giant leaps and bounds over the original title. There are, however, a number of small incremental improvements that I do think make for a better gameplay experience, but it does feel significantly close to the original title in most ways that matter. So while there are some subtle differences I'm going to call out over the course of this review, one thing I don't really think this game does at all is try to pull in new players, especially because if you've played Avernum 1, you likely know whether or not you enjoyed this enough to continue with the second title. Now, somewhat surprising to me, though, I actually did have a little bit more trouble getting Avernum 2 to run than I did the original, because all of these remakes were really made with 1080p monitors in mind, and so running them on, say, a 4K monitor, which is more standard today, can be a little bit frustrating. That said, the Crystal Souls remake here is from back in 2015, so you really shouldn't have too much trouble getting it to run, not least of which because it's very minimal system requirements. But the reason I had more trouble getting this one to run specifically largely came down to the fact that it handles the way it scales to the screen a little bit differently than the first game. That is to say, it didn't have options that were available in the first one, so what I had to do was use my PC's system settings to force it to use a compatibility mode, which was effectively having my PC handle the scaling rather than the game itself, and even then I still had to knock it down to 1080p to get it to go full screen. Otherwise, on the technical side of things, the only other problem I ran into is that the sort of big boss fight of the game I had to wind up doing twice because the first time I did it, it did not trigger the end slide, and after looking it up, I'm not the only person to have experienced that. So in a somewhat bizarre situation, Avernum 2 here is a little worse, technically speaking, than Avernum 1, at least the experience I had with it. But even in that instance, the problems are relatively minimal and nothing you can't fix with a little bit of know-how, so it's not that bad. Next up, I want to talk difficulty and the character editor. So difficulty is story through torment, basically affects the health and damage of the various enemies, pretty much exactly what you'd expect. Torment is very difficult, at least comparatively to story, obviously. So depending on how familiar you are with these games will likely determine what difficulty you want to play on, but the main thing I wanted to mention here is that Avernum 2 I found to be a much easier experience than the first game as well, which I would say largely comes down to two things. One, experience from having played the first game already, which means I kind of already knew what worked and what did not, but also because Avernum 2 here is actually much better paced than the original title, which kind of just throws you out into the world and you have to figure out things like what quests you can do because enemies are a certain level or whatever on your own, whereas Avernum 2 starts out putting you in a relatively small area where there's only so much you can do anyway before forcing you to move on. There's basically an intro sequence to the first couple areas of the game, meaning that the experience there is a very tailored one. And going through that and doing all that content puts you in a really good spot to, once you get access to the full world map, go about and explore as you please. There is very little as a result of that that you have to watch out for in terms of, okay, I need to do this once I get to a certain power level kind of stuff. And that's one of those subtle improvements that I wanted to touch on, is that Avernum 2 is, in my opinion, simply a much better paced game and experience than the original title was. But nonetheless, even if you are having problems, just like the first game, this one also features a character editor which you can enable from the main menu, and this is going to let you go in and just fully alter your character's stats and level up experience, which will certainly provide you an option of, respecking basically, or just making yourself so overpowered you can get past anything if you are experiencing trouble. Given how long these games have been out and the fact that I think, honestly, the writing and story tends to be the strongest aspect of them, I think that's honestly fine. And if anything, I think it's mostly just going to help more people experience these games. But that does bring us to character, or perhaps party creation, as we play a party of 4 here. Or at least in most cases, you'll play a party of 4. And each of those has a few different portraits that you can choose from to determine their sort of rough sprite, alongside some presets in terms of class and starting points, or you can go the custom route if you are comfortable doing that, which is what I did straight away from the beginning because I was so comfortable from the last time I had played. But notably different, however, is 2 here allows us to play as the Slithzerakai or the Nephilim, the lizard or cat people respectively, and that's important because they get slightly different racial bonuses from humans. For instance, the Slith are fantastic with spears, the Nephilim get a bonus to things like their initiative in combat, which continues as they level up. Humans, overpowered as ever though, get extra traits as they level up, which I found to be really, really strong, especially in the early game. It is probably worth it as well to have one of each in your party though, because there are some interactions that you'll only see if you have one in your party. But do keep in mind you can also edit this when you're in the game as well, so even this is not fully set in stone after character creation even, which brings us to the story setup and my thoughts on it. So I do think, as with the first game, the story is honestly probably the strongest thing this game has going for it, which continued here, and given that the game largely takes place across the same world map with a few tweaks and changes, which we'll get into, it was really cool to see how that world evolved over the course of just the 2 games that I've played here. Now, the reason it changes and evolves is a direct consequence of our actions in the first game. You see, the underworld of Avernum is hundreds of miles worth of cavern systems that the Empire, which controls the world above, has been chucking criminals into, which is basically anybody they deem to be a minor inconvenience or anybody branded as annoying, more or less, in some form or fashion. They toss everybody down there, and the people that have been tossed down there have formed their own sort of communities and governments, the whole 9 yards, which is, of course, where we get the Avernites from. In the previous game, our group of heroes did a few different things, but none more so important than assassinating the Emperor of the Empire above, exacting their revenge on the person that threw them down here to begin with the help of one Erica the Archmage. Unsurprisingly, then, this brought down a huge retaliation on the people of Avernum. So what the Empire has done is send troops into it in order to quell the people that they've sent down there, which I thought was especially interesting because you start the first game with the implication being that the Empire doesn't know what happens to people they send down here. They think they all die. But then over the course of the first game, you learn that that's not true at all. The Empire knows exactly what's going on down here and clearly has some of their own goals in mind, which is why they knew exactly how to get down into Avernum to fight these people the second it became prudent to do so. With that said, they aren't as familiar with the cave systems as the Avernites are, and they can only send a small amount of troops at once through dedicated portals that cost an immense amount of magical resources to use, which means, thanks to home field advantage and just the numbers they were fighting, the Avernites were largely able to hold the Empire off. But to make it more complicated still, an ancient race that you'll have encountered called the Vahanatai, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but these were a sort of alien race that you could encounter in a few places in the original Avernum, but it seems they've fully woken up in 2 and they start the game by placing barriers around the cave systems in order to get the lay of the land and understand what's happening, because it turns out that the Empire stole 3 of their ancestors in the form of crystal souls. So this alien race more or less summons you and your companions after a short proving of yours, and you are ultimately tasked with retrieving the crystal souls while also looking for ways to weaken the Empire's invasion. And that's basically the goal of this particular game. And I don't want to get into the exact details for the sake of spoilers here, but a few notes. Just like the original, there are 3 game-winning quests. The sort of true ending, if you want to put it that way, is doing all 3 of them because none of them actually ends the game. You can continue to play afterwards and explore, and each of them naturally puts the Avernites in a much better position against the Empire overall. And all of that, as usual with basically every spiderweb software game I've played, the writing was quite good. What I really enjoyed, though, is seeing the world evolve, because as I mentioned, it largely takes place across the same world map as the first, which means if you know where stuff is in that game, it's pretty easy to find it here. Outside of the new cave system made to accommodate the new race, the Vahanatai. But because of this, we get to see one town that we've explored previously that in this game is just completely gone. There's a section of the map that you can't explore too much because the Empire controls it, which requires things from you in order to navigate, which we'll get into. But as I've already mentioned, the more I play these games, the more I like the writing involved, and if anything, I think these games wind up being worth it more for the story rather than anything else. But that does bring us to progression systems, which, outside of a couple of small changes, are largely identical to the original game as well. As mentioned, a couple of small differences. For instance, some skills sort of are grouped together across your entire party. So like cave lore or arcane lore as an example, it takes your party's cumulative ranks in those to give you your total against the skill checks. Now in the first game, there were basically like 2 skill checks that were greater than the skill level attainable by a single person, so there wasn't much of a point in splitting them, whereas in this game there are more skill checks that require a higher amount than a single player can get, which means there are reasons to spread that out among party members. There's also a few extra magical abilities and things you'll be able to learn over the course of the game, but otherwise mostly the same stuff. We've got a soft cap of level 30, meaning that anything above level 30 gives you much reduced skill points and the like, but from level 1 until 30, as you level up, you'll get to put an attribute point into things, while also getting a free attribute to attributes in a set order, so you'll get one for free that it auto-assigns, and then one you can assign yourself. 2 skill points for the game's various trees to put into, martial abilities, magical abilities, the miscellaneous tree, also included in magic. Cave lore and arcane lore are especially important, so is tool use. Cave lore is going to let you explore more easily, find caches out in the world. Tool use will help you avoid traps and pick locks. Arcane lore is going to let you learn abilities from little stands you can find around, which is super helpful. And then the rest are more combat oriented. So at the bottom of the tree, you have like the base ability for the thing you're trying to do. That is to say, like melee weapons, thrown weapons, priest or mage spells, etc. And then everything above those can go up to a maximum of 10, so long as the skill below it is at least that same level or higher. So I can't put 10 points into a skill above what the bottom of it is if I've only got 5 invested. Otherwise, though, pretty simple system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the combat section. But the other part of progression remains the traits. So traits are little perks you can pick. Every other level, humans get more of these than everybody else. And these are going to give you larger bonuses to individual playstyles, like just straight up increasing your attributes, giving you better chances to, say, parry or counterattack, alongside a host of other things. But for the most part, what you want for each character is pretty straightforward based on what kind of character you're building, with only a few variations therein. Beyond that, progression largely comes down to gear as well as just other little things out in the world. Gear is especially important because heavy armor will encumber spell casting for mages, which you'll either have to overcome via things like traits or simply avoid, whereas martially focused characters have to pay attention to how much armor they are stacking on themselves because it reduces their chance to hit, which can be overcome by pumping points into the skills that give them more percentage hit chance, but even then I think it caps out at like 90%, with the rest of progression being tied to things like, say, getting passes or boats to allow you to navigate certain parts of the world more easily, which brings us to the gameplay and world section. So, as I've already talked about a bit, I think Avernum 2 here does such a good job compared to the first game of introducing you to the world in a way that feels a little more natural. So where the first game just dumps you out into it, the second game here confines you to a sizable area until you get the bulk of the story, at which point it lets you loose, so to speak, on the rest of the world map. The main world map is the same as always, with a couple of new additions in the form of the new cave system, with all of that being divided into, of course, actual explorable locations and then the world map, which has its own encounters and things for you to explore. So, as a result of that, having played the first game, that was extremely rewarding here because it was very easy to just sort of know where to go ahead of time, and because of that cleaner introduction, you're in a much better place to do all that exploring pretty much straight away. Now, while you will, of course, be chasing down the leads for the 3 game-winning quests, mostly, this is also going to be seeing you do a lot of odd jobs, both to level up and get resources to acquire more skills and experience. It's also necessary because in order to explore certain areas of the world, we're going to have to track down some items. For instance, the Empire uses a pass system, so in order to get through certain areas without a giant problem, you're going to need those passes, which means you need to track them down in order to get into certain areas of the map, which is the same for the Avernites clearance system. In light of the fact that they are actively at war, some areas are off limits based on your security clearance, and in order to get a better security clearance, you have to do more and more for the people of Avernum. Specifically, the mayor's is the most helpful. Doing this will allow you to go to the capital, the castle, which is going to let you upgrade your security clearance and give you access to more and more stuff. So you can, of course, chase down those leads on the main quest. So it is, again, a little more structured than I found the original to be. But the basics are largely the same. Now, because the world map is actually pretty sizable, one thing you're almost certainly going to want to do, as quickly as you can at least, is get access to the teleporter. The teleporter is absolutely necessary in order to get to a few different places around the map to chase down some of the leads you're going to need access to. But in order to get into the teleporter room in the Tower of Magi, you need Magi clearance from the capital, which sets you doing a bunch of quests just straight away. So you can get that clearance, so you can get access to the teleporter to do other quests, and a decently good chunk of the game is exactly like that. I don't think that's necessarily going to be for everybody, but I did find the exploration and seeing just how this world changed in light of this invasion in comparison to the state of the world previously was interesting to see here. And I'm actually really excited to then jump into Avernum 3 because I've heard that game has a really sort of evolving world that changes over the course of the game, and I'm kind of curious to see how that one winds up playing out. But I liked it quite a bit here, with one notable exception. One of the final areas of the game that I think is called like Angarok or something like that. That dungeon is horrendous. For the most part, I would say much of this game was much better paced, both in terms of the dungeons you're encountering, but also the enemies and things you find in them. And then just randomly, this like final dungeon really, or at least one of the final dungeons you'll encounter was awful. As you have to teleport into it, and then there is pretty much immediately like I think it's 5-wave fight against a whole host of enemies that are really spread out, which means the typical avenue of just grouping them up and AoEing them down, which you'll use for most of the game, is much more difficult to pull off there. You're also at a disadvantage just in terms of the distance you are from enemies when they spawn in. And there's also just so many enemies that you're likely to be struggling for resources when you finish that fight up. And then the catch is, that's just the start of the dungeon. You still have the rest of it to do after this horrendous start. So if you go into that dungeon unprepared and with, say, not enough resources to overcome this, you very well might be in for a bad time. And that's completely discounting how just long that starting fight is because of all the enemies. Cannot stress enough how much I did not enjoy that. Honestly, kind of feels like it's from a different game entirely, which might actually be the case because from what I understand, it was significantly reworked from the previous entries. But talked a lot about combat there, so let's talk about combat. Now, one thing that changed almost not at all from the first game was combat. If anything, it's a little easier, mind you, but mechanically and gameplay approach-wise, almost identical. Very, very little different here. Turn-based action point system, attacking will generally end your turn, but there are ways around that, like for instance the Discipline Adrenaline Rush, which is useful on all characters, magic or melee or martially focused. And we can get Adrenaline Rush by putting up to 15 points in the martial skill tree, which will give you access to battle disciplines the more you put into it, one of which, that you get at 15 points invested, is Adrenaline Rush, which effectively allows you to attack up to 3 times if you're standing still. And that, combined with a mage's AoEs and a little bit of dexterity to increase your initiative, means that you're just bombarding enemies before they get a chance to move in most cases. That is just simply put the most effective way to play the game. Combine that with a couple of tanks to take the damage, and you're pretty much good to go. Now, archers and things like that are still available, mind you, but just like the first game, they're a little underwhelming because they, can't fit into one of those 2 molds, which are extremely effective in terms of how this game is and the number of enemies you'll be fighting. Because you're often so outnumbered, spamming AoEs in this way is really just kind of the name of the game in terms of wiping out enemy groups before you get just battered by the action economy into the dirt. But discounting a couple new magic spells, which one of which allows you to, for instance, make a copy of an enemy you're fighting only to summon it as a minion later, all the abilities, etc. are mostly identical. Now, some of that does actually relate to traversal and will have different effects in or out of combat. For instance, we see the addition of Stone Shatter here, which will let you crumble walls outside of combat, but inside of combat just does some damage. There's also the Sanctification ritual for priests, which will let you cleanse dark altars, but just heals you otherwise in combat. But discounting those abilities, again, identical basically to that first game. Almost nothing changed from the strategies or approaches, anything like that. Which is great if you like that system, not so great if you didn't. But given that it's a mostly one-person development team, you can see why it was done that way, to be sure. And I do think that's one of the reasons I personally at least largely enjoy the story of these games more so than the combat experience. Which is pretty much all I've got to say about combat here, which brings us to the Steam Deck section. This game officially has a playable rating for all the reasons you would expect, not least of which were some of those resolution scaling issues I mentioned all the way at the beginning of the video, but also because it does not have proper controller support, meaning you will have to manually map the keys if you want to do everything there. Some of the in-game text is extremely small, even if you scale it up using some in-game options. But if you are fine with those drawbacks and you're willing to put in a little bit of work, yes, you can play this on the Steam Deck. It is more than capable of handling this absolutely circuit-frying monstrosity of a graphical experience, and that's pretty much all there is to say on the Steam Deck, which brings me to positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, once again, the story. I really enjoyed seeing how the world evolved and things changed, and while you might not be able to necessarily immediately see the improvements this game made over the first game, they are there, and those incremental improvements were much appreciated by me, at least. The better pacing, the better initial structure, the little subtle tweaks to things like allowing you to play as the Nephilim or the Slith are fun, small changes if you really invested into that first game. But we do have some negatives, and I think if there were any one negative I were to point out about this game is that it is not a game that is trying to reinvent the wheel or really do much of anything grander than that original title. Almost all of the systems are the same, the map is mostly the same, etc. And as a result of that, if you were to tell me this was just like a small expansion or DLC for the original game, I'd be inclined to believe you just because of the scope of this. And I couldn't help but feel as I was walking back and forth to various towns and locations in order to get clearances, to go to this place, to go to that place, to learn the location of this place so I could go to the Mage Tower and just teleport there afterwards. It would have been nice to, rather than some of this tedious, busy work, try to push things a little farther, say mechanically speaking. But again, given that this was mostly a one-man operation, that's not exactly some big surprise on my part. And then lastly for the negatives, mostly that Angirosh, I do not know, but what I do know is that dungeon is horrible, and honestly kind of the worst part of this entire game combined. But that does bring me to my conclusion. For the most part, I would say Avernum 2 Crystal Souls is a game that makes a lot of incremental improvements over its predecessor, and if you enjoyed that original game alongside its story, you'll likely really enjoy this one and all the, again, incremental improvements and changes to the world and advancement of that story. But it really doesn't do anything else than that, which means it's a very specific experience. And for that experience, the game itself is $20 US over on Steam, though you can regularly find it on sale for just a couple of bucks. In fact, I bought pretty much all these bundled together. I think it was for like $9 or $10. And for that price, you'll get more than a couple hours worth of pretty good CRPG experience. Mostly, I think the writing is really great, with the rest of the game being serviceable enough in the pursuit of that sort of main draw. And that, combined with the price, makes it an easy enough game to recommend to people, especially if you are really enjoying CRPGs. Which I think is pretty much everything I've got to say about Avernum 2 Crystal Souls, so I think that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Which is as good a time as any for you to let me know how you feel about this one down in the comments section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.